How's it going, traders? Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and this is your boy, the Forex Amateur. So, as promised, I said I would be doing a weekly outlook. I actually supposed to start this 2 weeks ago or a week ago. I can't really recall when I did post it, but unforeseen circumstances, I was unable to do so. However, I have been monitoring the market, and after some careful consideration, I've decided that I will do the weekly outlook on a Monday morning every week going forward, right? I will look at the stuff that I look at or the pairs and indices that I look at, right? I'll give you an outlook of what I'm looking at for that week. And obviously, you can always use that to make your trading decisions, or you could use that for your educational purposes. Before I get into it, remember, I am not qualified to offer financial investment or trading advice. Everything I speak about on these videos is purely educational content. I do not recommend any specific trade or action. If you are trading live funds, understand that the financial markets are very risky and you could lose your entire investment. So let's get straight into it. And we're going to start off with the dollar index on the daily chart. But before we get into this week's outlook, I just want to start from the monthly chart really quickly. And let's look at a few things on the monthly chart, right? Let me just grab my annotator here. What color should I use? Let's use yellow. I think yellow is pretty bright. All right, cool. So let's look at the monthly chart, right? We can see that the dollar index formed some sort of a resistance here. It did a false breakout to the upside at this point, and then it pulled back, breaking market structure here to the downside. Obviously, there was some sort of a support at this level as well, which has also been broken to the downside. So overall, looking from this area here, this is the current range. If price was to break to the upside, apologies for that. If price was to break to the upside, then we would be bullish. If it was to break to the downside, then we would be bearish. However, considering what's happened at this area in here, we are currently bearish. So we would need a break above this level in here, a sustained break above that level for us to change our bias, right? Going over to this side, you can see that, hey, we formed a bit of a resistance in this level here. We had another false breakout, and then we had a break of market structure of all of these lows in there. So overall, confirmed this move to the downside. We also have this move to the downside. What we can notice, however, at this specific point is that price is failing to break below this level here. For whatever reason, it is currently failing to break below this level here. So what I would be of the thought process right now is that price would actually come back to come and retest some of these levels in here, right, before we are able to see that sustained push to the downside. Okay, now this is obviously a long-term analysis where we would see price come back to around this level in here, and then whatever it does at this level here perhaps goes to the upside or perhaps carries on to the downside. That doesn't really matter. But overall, looking at it, we are bearish bias on this market at the moment. Dropping down to the weekly chart as well, you can see I've basically mapped out my range on the weekly chart. This is my range, right? We can see that we've had a break to the downside of this range. With broken market structure, broken market structure, broken market structure again to the downside. So this is also reassuring us that, hey, we are bearish in this market. So what I'm actually looking for right now is I'm looking for price to come back and either retest this level here or come back and retest this level of supply right in here. Because what can you see in this area is you can see that we've had a drop, we've had a base, and we've had another drop, right? So there is actually some sort of selling pressure or sellers sitting at this level, looking, if price were to get back into there, we would expect a nice long push to the downside. You can also notice that there isn't really much momentum in this push to the upside, right? Obviously, once price maybe breaks this level in here, we might see a big push just to come back into this level and push price to the downside, right? Looking at the daily chart, and this is where my weekly outlook is going to start from, right? Now, when we look at the daily chart, what do we notice about this? We see price bottomed out at this level in here, formed a resistance at this level, which was broken at that point. So at that point in there, this became a switch or momentum switch, or it became a switch in market structure or a market structure switch, if you want to call it that. Sorry, I'm mincing up my words a little bit. It's my first video for the week, so please forgive me. I promise I will be getting better as we go into the week. So looking at this here, we can see after that momentum switch or market structure switch, we can see price came back and found a level of support here, which it did a false breakout from here and then pushed to the upside, then breaking this market structure. So that's telling us that we are short-term bullish on this market and we should expect this market to continue to the upside, which it obviously did. Price came and formed new structure here, new structure there. So this is a low, higher high, higher low, and now it's forming a higher high. So if we're looking at just market structure in itself, we would expect price to do something like that and then maybe come back and form a higher low somewhere in here and continue to the upside. However, what I'm expecting is I'm expecting price to actually come into this area, this yellow line that I've got marked in here at around 93.05, and I'm looking to see price sort of drop from that level, most likely back into this pink level that I've got marked up in here. Why? Because we've got a rally base and we've got another rally in here. So there is some, just as what we were looking at on the weekly, where it had a base in here where we were looking for sellers to the downside. On the daily, as you can see it in here, we've got a push, got a push and a push back to the upside. Sorry, I actually drew that wrong. Got a push, push, and a push. Price has not come back to test this level of demand in here. So I would expect something like a price coming back into this area before it continues to the upside, or coming into this area and then just breaking through and dropping all the way, because overall on the weekly, monthly time frame, we are currently bearish. Let's just have a look at the intraday chart on the 4-hour, and then we'll move over to the next chart. All right, cool. Now this, I like to see this when I'm looking to take a reversal in a trend. All right, so when I'm looking to take a reversal, I really like to see things like this happening. So what you can notice in here is that what's actually happened is price has pushed off from here, failed to form a higher high, right? I don't consider that a higher high because we don't have a bullish candle close above there. Pulled back, formed a higher low, and then pushed up and formed a higher high, which it has not come back and formed another higher low in these areas in here. What actually happened thereafter is price has now pushed up and it's now consolidating in this area here. So what I would be looking for is I would be looking for a false break to the upside, and then I would be looking to take this market back to the downside. So overall on dollar going into the next week, I would expect perhaps for the beginning of the week, we'd see some sort of a bullishness coming into this market, right? However, for the long term, for the remainder of the week, I would actually expect dollar to come back down into this area here. Now, if it does not respect 93.05, this yellow block that I've got marked in here, that is my next rejection zone. So that is the highest point that I would expect sellers to come into this market. So that little zone in there, if we were to map it out, let's just mark this out here. If we were to map it out, we'd put it at between 93, say 93.40, 93.40 and 94. 93.40 and 94. So that would be the highest level that I would actually expect sellers to come in and push this market back to the downside. Cool. So moving on from that, we can see that what we've got is our bias set in terms of dollar. So if you're trading any of the major pairs or cross pairs that have dollar influence, then you can obviously use that as sort of a guiding bias towards the rest of your pairs. Let's move on to odd USD, and this is one of my favorite pairs coupled with Euro USD, which is my main pair that I do trade on currencies. Looking at odd USD right now, we are obviously in a bearish market. If we come off the monthly time frame in here, you can see that I actually had my yellow line. So the yellow line that I normally put on my chart is just basically a pivot point, right? It's where I basically notice price comes and it starts that initial impulse to the downside. Obviously, price can always come back and break above it and then push to the downside. But this is my first point of interest where I'm looking to see some sort of a switch in momentum before I start looking for trades, right? Looking at this right now, we can see that we were in a long-term bearish move to the downside in here. We formed this lower high, lower low, another lower high, and another lower low at this point. Price then pushed up and broke above this lower high, right? That after it broke above that lower high, it formed a higher low and then it pushed up and it's now formed a higher high. Once this month's candle closes, then this will confirm, as long as it does close lower than this wick, it will confirm this as a higher high, right? Then after that, what would we obviously expect, right? So we've got low, we've got higher high, higher low, higher high. After that, we would obviously expect this market to sort of pull back into around these regions in here and then continue to the upside if it is, or proceed to the downside if it is. But all in all, looking at this, we're looking for some sort of a higher low in around this area in here. So that tells us we're long-term bearish bias on USD, which works really, really well with what we're looking at on dollar as well, because if you recall on the monthly chart, we're looking for dollar to push up to the upside because it is respecting that level of demand, that level of support at the bottom side. So we're looking for it to push up and retest some of those levels above it and then push to the downside. So that does work really well with here, because in here we're looking for a push to the downside and then followed by a push to the upside. So the relationship between the two is obviously inverse. If you're expecting dollar to sell, you would expect Australian dollar to buy, right? In this instance here, as you can see, that's very, very clear. Let's move down to the weekly chart. I apologize if I am moving a bit too quick. If I am, please leave a note in the comments and I'll be sure to perhaps slow down on my next video. Looking in this area here on the weekly, we can clearly see that price is sort of consolidating in this area. In here, we do have a break to the upside and then a pull back into this range, right? So right now, if we look at it, a break below here means that we'll see some downside. A break above here means that we'll see a much longer upside on this pair, right? Looking at that very simply, knowing that we're sitting at a key area on the monthly chart, however, we are looking for sells. If we drop down to the daily time frame, now very clearly on the daily, you can see that's that high that was formed, that's that low, that's that higher high, and then we can see price sort of fizzling out here at this low in this area. But what we can notice is that this was the last higher low that was formed. To form that higher high, we pull back, form the lower low, lower high, and then pushed on to form another lower low. As I've discussed in my market structure video, if price breaks a previous low once, that is showing a sign that there would be bearish momentum coming into the market. But if it does break a low again, that is clearly showing you a switch in momentum to the downside. And obviously it would be the opposite for the buy opportunities, right? If you have not watched that video, be sure to check out that video where I spoke about market structure. As you can see, it is a guiding principle or a grounding principle or a founding principle for my analysis. Looking at this area in here now, what I'm basically looking for is I'm looking for some sort of a retest into around these levels here and then pushing the market to the downside. This is obviously my yellow line that I've been speaking about, which is a pivot point. As you can see, price came really close to it and it started to change trend to the upside, right? Not necessarily a change in trend, but it started to buy. So that's what I mean. It is a pivot point where you will most likely see some sort of a switch in momentum when price does hit that level. And as you can see in this instance, price has obviously done so in this instance. So looking at this very clearly, I am looking for some sort of a pull up into the upside and then price pushing back to the downside, which works really, really well with what we're looking at on dollar index again, just to mention, because if we look at the daily chart, I'm looking at some sort of a pull to the upside into around 93.05 and then a push down. And in here, we're looking for a bit of a pull to the upside and then a push down. Now, in this instance here, because dollar index does have a bit more that it can push up into around 93.05, we can always expect to see some sort of a push down on odd USD into around this area here before we get that retracement into this zone that I'm looking for. And that is when we'll look to take sales back down into around this area in here or lower if the price does allow us to. Let's have a look at the intraday chart and let's see if we've got any information on here. Cool. So looking at the intraday chart very simply, we can see price bottomed out at this level. We've got a nice counter trend, 1, 2, 3 hits at the bottom. So that would form like a counter trend wedge to the upside. We can see price broke out from that level and then broke market structure here, forming a new high at that point. Now, if this does hold, then we would expect price to pull back and form some sort of a higher low in around this area and then push back up into that area. So what I'm looking at very closely this week is I'm looking to see, or should I say today going into tomorrow, I'm looking to see if price can respect this broken market structure in here, pull back and form a higher low in around that area, actually a bit lower than that, let's say around this area here, pull back and form a higher low in here, and then I'll be looking to take buys up into around there. Cool, very straightforward, right? Moving on to Euro USD, looking at the monthly chart, not really much we can speak about on the monthly. I do recall posting an analysis for Euro USD for sales about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and that is currently working very, very well at the moment. So if you did get an opportunity to make the most of it, I'm glad you did. If not, be sure to go back and check that out. I think I put it on my IG, but I'm not really sure. If I can track it down, I will repost that, or I will show it on the next video. Looking at this right now, we can see that we are in a obvious downtrend, right? Because price gave us the strong push to the downside, sort of bottomed out here, broke this market structure, right? But failed to sustain this move and came back and broke below this market structure in here. So very obvious right now is we are seeing a sort of transition into a bullish move, right? Perhaps coming back into around this area in here. But looking inside of what's happening in here, we can see prices respecting this level. Sorry for my drawing, it's not my strong point. Price is basically respecting this level in here, and we can see something pushing price to the downside. What I am expecting right now is I am expecting to see, because we've had this sort of level that's formed very strongly, and then we've had this break of market structure to the upside, forming this higher high, higher low, higher high, right? I am expecting to see some sort of a push into around this level in here, right? Or even higher, forming a higher low, and then pulling back up into around this area here, where we would most likely see maybe some sells, or we can even see price just sort of continue and come back to retest this level in there. So very straightforward. Short term, we are looking at sells, right? Looking at the weekly chart, you can see very, very clearly that we have this sort of consolidated pullback that's happening in here. It's not very impulsive, right? And that is telling us that most likely when price comes into around these areas here, we're most likely going to see a bullish push, right? Because if you look at it here, we had an impulse bullish push. Here, we had an impulse bullish push. What you can notice about this area as well, which I haven't highlighted on this analysis, is you can notice that we've got a level of demand right in that area. We had this rally, we had this base, and now we had another rally. So most likely price will be, whether it's off this blue area here or whether it's off this level in here, we would most likely see some sort of buys coming in there. But for right now, going into the new week and into perhaps next week, we most likely should still expect sells on this market. Let's move on to the daily chart. Looking at the daily chart, I do have some very clear levels that I've marked up on here. I've also posted an analysis last week sometime for buys off of this pivot point, which is my yellow line. And as you can see, we're still waiting for that. We did have some sort of buyer participation in here, but it's not really convincing. And as you can see, today's candle has sort of pushed it back down. So that was perhaps some sort of manipulation over Thursday and Friday, but price is still sort of going to come back into this area. So looking at it for this week with fresh eyes, we can see that, hey, market structure is obviously, we've broken this higher low here, right? Price has pushed down, formed a lower low, formed a lower high, another lower low, came back, did a false breakout here, but that would still be a lower high because we didn't get a candle close, or we can say these are equal highs or double top or whatever. Why? Because there's no candle close above this previous high in here, right? And that's what I consider a break of market structure. At that point there, we can see a break of market structure. At here, we can see a break of market structure. So currently looking at this market, this is our range. That's our range low. That is our range high. Or you could even consider that the range high, because we do have a swing high forming in there. Very simply looking at this, we can see a drop, we can see a base, we can see another drop in there. So most obviously, I would actually expect price to be revisiting this area here, whether it revisits it and continues to the upside, or revisits it and then drops to the downside, which is most likely because we are in a bearish trend. I am expecting price to come back into this area. So looking for the new week, I am looking at this specific price here, which is around 1.17391. And that would be an area that I'd be looking to take buys. If price does sort of break through here, then this would be my next level that I would be looking to take my buys from, which is around, say, between 1.16900 and 1.16. right? So that's my area. This is basically the overall area that I'm looking to take buys from on this market. Let's have a look at the intraday chart and let's see if there's anything to share on there. This video is actually going to be a bit more longer than the rest of the videos going forward, because if you've watched any of my weekly outlook videos in the past, you'll know that generally on the first video, I like to cover a thorough analysis from the monthly down. However, once the precedent has been set and you guys have an understanding of my bigger picture, then I will just be looking at the daily and H4 charts going forward for every other week, until obviously there is a change in my outlook on the higher time frame charts. Looking at the H4 very clearly, as you can see, and here we've got this push to the downside, which isn't very impulsive, because you can see it around this area here, price just started sort of trickling, and then it gave this big push to the downside. I think this would have been around Friday, if I'm not mistaken. This should have been around Friday, and then we had this push. Yeah, Thursday evening to Friday morning, right? So looking at this right now, all I'm looking at in here is I'm still looking at this specific price level that I have. And as I highlighted on the, I think it was on the dollar index on the 4-hour chart, where when price is coming into my level and I start seeing this bit of consolidation and lack of momentum in the opposing direction, I really like to see that happening, because then it's a higher probability, because this is showing me that momentum to the downside is dying down. And all I need to see now is the last kick of a dying horse coming into this level, and then I'll push to the upside. Apologies for the analogy, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? So very simply, I'm just looking for that pump back to the downside in here to come into my preferred price, and then I'll be looking to take this market to the upside. Let's move on to the synthetic indices. So we'll look at volatility indices really quickly. I hate the way this thing is moving in here. I want to see it break down, and it's just not doing that. It's pissing me off. All right, let's look at, there's nothing to see on the monthly chart on volatility 75, so we'll just start on the weekly chart. Looking at the weekly chart on volatility 75, we've obviously got this demand zone in here, which price is currently reacting off. And it's proving a bit difficult for price to sort of break below here, which is understandable, because like I said, it came off of this demand zone in here, forming this high, right? So now our range is from that high to this low, and I'll be looking to see perhaps a retest into around here, and then we'll perhaps see price drop back to the downside or continue to the upside. Looking at this, we're simply looking at a buy bias market right now. Let's go to the daily time frame. Looking at the daily time frame in here, this is the range that I had mapped out previously that I was actually trading. And you can see that this is my range low, this is my range high in here, coming off this basic big push to the upside. You can see this consolidated pullback to the downside, and you can see that price has now done what? It's actually broken market structure, right? Because this was the last lower high, forming this lower low, which should fail to break here, pull back into here, forming a higher low, and it's now broken there. So my thought process right now is I'm actually looking for sells at this level, and I'm looking to come back into around this area here. However, if it doesn't allow it, then it doesn't allow it. But for now, I'm actually looking for sells off of this area down into here to form some sort of a higher low in this area, and then look to take it back to the upside from that point. Let's look at the H4 chart very quickly. H4, I did have this level marked up in here where price was sort of holding in here, but I actually just noticed this huge rejection off here. Wow. All right, so it is showing that price is basically struggling to break to the downside from this level. If we get a breakout to the upside from here, then we should expect price to just continue to the upside for another couple more days before we can see it drop down. Overall, I have no analysis to the upside in here, because I am looking to see a retracement in this market, right? There isn't really much that it can do on the upside, other than the fact that it's most likely going to come back into this level here. If it does break out impulsively from here, then I would expect it to come back into around this area in here, or even much higher than that. Let's move on to volatility 10. Looking at volatility 10 very simply on the monthly chart, we don't really have much analysis because there's no data to the left-hand side of the chart. We can see, however, that we're in a strong bearish trend, lower high, lower low, lower high, lower low right now in that area. So I am expecting some sort of a pullback, whether it's to form another lower high to continue down, or whether it is to just break market structure, form a higher low and push to the upside. Either which way, I'm expecting a pullback on this market. Not really going to look at the weekly chart because there isn't much on there that differentiates it from the monthly. Looking at the daily, we can see a strong break to the downside here. In this instance here, it's very, very choppy in this movement to the downside, but it's expected because volatility 10 is a very slow mover, but it generally does respect the trend and it just keeps on pushing and pushing, right? In this instance here, we broke market structure to the downside. We have not seen a strong enough lower high being formed before price pushes to the downside, but we can see the price pull back and broke market structure again. As I always say, breaking market structure and then breaking market structure again is showing us a strong momentum switch to the downside, and price is now continuing to the downside. We can see that price pulled back into this area here and still respected this lower high because, as I said previously, there isn't a strong candle close. We can consider this one candle here as a candle close to the upside, but it's not really strong enough because, as you can see, the very next candle came and traded up and then it rejected and it engulfed this previous candle. So that's telling us that there's still very strong momentum to the downside. So I am expecting to see this market sort of break below these lows in the coming week and even break below this low in here and continue to the downside, perhaps a bit lower before it does pull back. So as you can see here, there's my yellow line. That's where I'll expect my first pivot point, and this did happen at this point, very close to it. But going forward right now, I would actually expect it to come back into this yellow block at the bottom. Not really much I can say about the intraday chart because, as you can see, it's just pretty much the same analysis. What we can notice, however, is that we had a false break above these highs in here, not necessarily a market structure break, or you can consider this a break of market structure to the downside, which means that we should expect price to sort of continue to the downside. But what I would actually expect is I'm looking at this specific level in here because we've got a drop, we've got a base, and we've got a drop that sort of broke all of these lows in here, right? So this is the stronger drop that I would actually expect price to sort of come into it. However, if it doesn't, then we would expect it to respect this high and then continue to the downside. Let's move on to volatility 100, where I just missed this trade. So looking at volatility 100 on the monthly, not really much I want to speak about on the monthly, but on the weekly, we can have a look at that. Looking at the weekly, I had this level marked up in here for price to push off of. I think I did also post this analysis as well. Price did reject very strongly off there. As you can see, my pivot point, which is the yellow line, it also works in this instance, and it has also driven price to the downside. So short term, we are sell bias on this market, or should I say long term, actually, because we're in a long term downtrend. We've broken market structure here, got a strong impulse to the downside. We've got a pullback, strong rejection, and we would expect this to continue below these previous lows in here, right? Very clear on this market in this instance. First targets, we can target this area. Second targets would be at this area, and then we'll just keep holding and taking it down to around that area in there. Moving on to the daily chart. As you can see on the daily chart as well, I think this is still the weekly. Yeah, this is the weekly pivot. You can see that price came up, broke above this pivot point very strongly to come and retest my level or my zone up in there. And it came back, retested it, and now it's dropping in this instance. I am expecting some sort of a bullish push off of this level in here. Hopefully I can get a pull back and then we can hop in somewhere in there to take this market to the downside. Overall, we have not seen a switch in market structure yet, because as you can see, this is still the dominant low in this market that created this high, right? So once we get a break below here, then we'll expect this market to continue to the downside. If it does pull back and break to the upside, I would not be looking for buys in this market. I would still be looking for a sell off around that area to continue back to the downside. Let's move on to the H4 chart and then we'll be done. So looking at the H4 chart in here, I remember what I wanted to do at this point. Did I take this trade? I can't recall whether I did. I think I did take this trade. Let's have a look in this instance here. We can see that price is obviously bearish, right? Pushed to the downside in this instance. What I noticed about this, however, is that we had a strong impulse to the upside, and this is very contracted pullback in this instance here. So we might most likely see that pop into there and then see a push to the upside to around that level, and then we can look to take sales back to the downside. Overall, however, looking at what's currently happening on the chart, we very clearly broke market structure to the downside, very clearly broke market structure to the downside, formed a lower low, confirmed lower high at this point in here, and price is obviously now pushing to the downside. This would still be a level that I would look for some short buys, perhaps into here, or if possible into there, but I would be looking to get in on sales if price does come back up into around this area and pushes back to the downside. Cool, so that's very straightforward. That's about it for the charts that I need to cover on today's session or today's video. Until next time, it has been a pleasure as always to share with you guys, and I'm wishing you a blessed and a profitable trading day and trading week going forward. Catch up again on next week's video.